All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Felucia. I'm a licensed psychologist. And today, in today's video, we're going to be talking about coercive control. And I would like to thank you guys for giving me some video topics there in one of the lives, not one of the lives, one of the community posts that I have. I had asked you all, what are some of the topics you would like to see or topics you'd like to have discussed for a live, and someone had stated that they wanted to learn more about coercive control, and so we're going to be talking about that today. And so if you are in the chat, if you're watching or anything like that, go ahead and leave a comment so that I know that you're here. And also let me know about any questions that you might have. I see somebody in the chat. So, hi, how are you, Liz? I see Liz. Good to see you again, Liz. So it's great. I'm glad that we're already, starting and seeing some people in here. So this, in case you didn't know, the topic for today, it is coercive control. And so I'll be talking about that today, and also, how coercive control is related to spiritual abuse. So, and of course, with all the lives that I have, it doesn't necessarily have to be just that topic. If you if you have a question or anything like that, it would be great if you can put it in the chat, and then we can go from there. So so I'll take a minute. For all of you who are in the chat, do you know what coercive control is? I'd be curious if you know what that is. So I'll wait a second to see if there are any responses on that. And then also what I will do as well is just putting some notes down here. I'm going to, there are different definitions regarding coercive control. So what I'll do is I'll start out by talking about what it is. And then, afterward, we can, people can chime in on how they think it relates to spiritual abuse. So if you're in the chat and you have not been here before, definitely introduce yourself. I'm seeing some regulars here, which is great. So, if you are here for the first time, or even if you're not, you can always say hi in the chat. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is explain, what coercive control is. And it's not really too different from what it sounds like. Coercion, first of all, it probably would make sense to define what the word coercion is. So I'll look here. I like reading definitions. So I'll read this definition here of coercion. It says the practice of persuading someone. So let me start again. The practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. So that is what coercion is. It is, it's force. It's using force, but it's using force in a subtle way. Things like threats, manipulation, things like that. So it's not, it's not just telling somebody, hey, you have to do this. It's forcing someone to do it through either using threats, intimidation, manipulation, and things like that. And so if we look at what coercive control looks like, it basically is trying to take over somebody's life, or trying to take over control of some domain of somebody's life or existence through using coercion, right? And so, there's there are ways in which this can happen. Sometimes people don't just, like, if you think about coercive control, people have asked about that. And I think the reason why this question has come up is because when we think about things like spiritual abuse or abusive situations where there are multiple people involved, you can't, it's difficult for the person who was doing the abusing. I would say it's difficult. It doesn't make sense for the person who's doing the abusing to just come out and declare their intentions. And this is something that's I often state regarding spiritual abuse. Spiritual abusers don't announce their intentions. They don't announce that they're here to take over your life. And so it's the same thing with coercive control. When individuals are involved in coercive control, they are using subtle threats. They're using things like intimidation and manipulation to control the outcome of somebody's life. And this often happens where you are, it happens in cults, but it also happens in situations where there's abuse. And when there are multiple people involved. It doesn't always happen that way where there are groups of people. It can happen on one-on-one situations as well. So, many of the examples that people have talked about in these in our live streams involve coercive control, right? So if you think about, some people have talked about how they were told that they couldn't marry somebody or had to marry a particular person. They couldn't get this job, or they couldn't move to this place, or they couldn't make any major life decisions without the approval of some other person. And that's an example of coercive control. People should be able to be free to make whatever decisions they want, right? And so when you are in a place where they're telling you that your life decisions are dependent on somebody else's approval, that's an example of coercive control. The reason why coercive control is especially concerning is because it happens over time and it happens repeatedly. So you'll have situations where somebody is told repeatedly that they have to do something or they can't do something. You'll see patterns of interaction in which people's movements could be being watched. They could be told that they have to account for certain things, how they spend their money, their whereabouts, things like that. And it is the way coercive control works is that it gets worse over time, and the levels of control get stronger and higher, right? And so people talk about when they're part of like a spiritually abusive institution or an abusive relationship, how things at the beginning weren't all that bad, right? Things may have been very good in the beginning, actually. And then over time, they realize that they're not functioning the way that they're used to functioning. Sometimes people will say that they feel like they are a shell of their former selves, or other people around them might say, hey, you've changed a lot. You seem less lively. You seem to always be panicky or withdrawn, things like that. And so that's an example of how coercive control can change people over time. Does anybody, I'll take a minute here. Do any of you identify with that? Have you ever experienced anything like that in a spiritual setting or any other kind of relationship? I'd be curious about that to see if you've experienced that at all. Hey, Gordon, how are you doing? Good to see you. I remember you from, I don't know if you were in the last live, but I know that you had posted some comments. So it's good to see you. Good to see you. I think maybe this is the first time you've been here in live, Gordon. So it's good to see you. Okay, Liz, you said you have. If you wouldn't mind, take a minute to let us know what were some of the things that you experienced, and if you feel comfortable sharing it in the comments. So what I liken coercive control to is, think about a situation. Imagine you're in your residence and someone just comes in and they say, hey, I'm here to take over your life. I'm here to take over your home. I'm here to take over your life. Let me in. You're not going to let that person in. And even if they force their way in, you'd have them kicked out. You'd have them forcibly removed. right? But let's say, somebody comes to your door and they are in a lot of distress, right? Maybe they say that they're, running away from somebody trying to harm them. You take them in, and over time, you feel bad for them, so you try to help them get on their feet. They stay there, and over time you realize, they had, not only have they not left, but they're starting to, make themselves a little too comfortable in your place, right? And then after a while, not only are they making themselves too comfortable, they start acting like it's their place. And soon, before you know it, they've pretty much taken over, and now they're telling you where you can sleep and what you can eat, and they basically sort of like pirated your home and taken over, right? So that's what coercive control is like. It's more like the second example. Okay, I see a comment here. I was told that I had to marry a certain man because that was God's perfect will versus permissive will. If I didn't, I would be in disobedience and have repercussions. Wow. So that is not only spiritual abuse there, but that's coercive control. So notice that they're not telling you marry this man or else, but they are saying, hey, if you don't do this, if you don't go along with what we want, then these bad things are going to happen. And something that unfortunately I'm seeing a lot of in comments that concerns me is how much these people and environments use fear of the unknown and connect fear to something spiritual. So things like saying that you're going to have repercussions, like whatever those are. Nobody has a perfect life, and we all have times where we, go through things. And so imagine being in that situation and having something difficult happen to you, and then you now start to become fearful, thinking, well, maybe this is because I didn't do what they said I had to do. Yeah, yeah, as if bad things don't happen regardless. Yeah, exactly. Something else is that in these abusive environments, everything is very transactional, and they make spirituality a transaction. So instead of having spirituality be something that you participate in for your own, I would say, enlightenment and growth, it's very transactional. So if you do this, you get this. If you don't do this, then this will happen. And and there can be, they can make it seem appealing in some ways, like if you do this, you'll get all these good things. And then when people do that and they don't get all the good things that were promised, then it becomes very you deal with a lot of discouragement and disillusionment. And on the other side, the bad things that are happening, people will twist spirituality and make it seem like you brought those things on yourself because you didn't obey what they told you to do. So I was saying I'm trying to recall what I had said before about coercive control, and basically the examples I gave. There's one about the person, kind of just taking over your residence, and and you go from being the owner to somebody who is being told, what you can do and the rights you have within your own home. And that's often how coercive control works. And you'll see facets of this again in abusive relationships where people are using threats and fear to take over, but it doesn't always start out that way. And something else that is concerning when people are in when they're in situations of coercive control is that it will look like they are willingly giving over their rights to another person. When, if you remember what I talked about with gaslighting, I say that when with gaslighting happens, you do the dirty work of the gaslighter for them. You doubt yourself. You think that you are unable to perceive reality accurately. So the things that they want to do to you, you end up doing to yourself, and it's sort of the same thing with coercive control. So that's why when it comes to legal issues, it can be really difficult to prove sometimes in court, because they might say, well, you gave this person access to your finances, or you let them stay in your place, things like stay at your home or whatever it was, things like that. And so when people are willingly giving over resources and control, and I say willingly, um, it may look like it's willing, but there is a lot of coercion, fear, intimidation, and threats behind that. Has anybody else experienced anything like coercive control before? And if so, what was it like? Was it related to spiritual abuse, or another abusive relationship? Um, Sometimes, people, there's a really good article here that I'm going to go through on Healthline that talks about coercive control and just some of the aspects of it. And something that, so I'll start out with some of the things that they had talked about. And these are also very similar to what can happen in spiritual abuse. So the first thing is isolation, and isolating you from your support system. That's part of coercive control. Oh, I see a comment here. Oh my goodness. Ex-apostle would say all doors home should be open for use by the church, which had no building. He preached it as if God would take our hard-earned assets if we didn't. Oh my goodness. They would say our assets were not our own. That's so interesting and just awful. They say that their assets weren't yours, but then it looks like they're taking ownership of it, right? If you wouldn't mind sharing, was this associated with a particular like denomination or anything? I'm just curious. Regardless, that's a great example of coercive control, right? You have your own finances, your own resources, and then someone else is saying, no, we control that now. And if you don't hand it over to us, these bad things are going to happen. There's always this, coercion involves threats, right? And if you see with all these examples, there's always some sort of threat. God will take this thing away. You'll be punished. You'll be judged. All these bad things will happen. And your example that you talked about is not uncommon amongst spiritually abusive environments. They'll say things like, instead of saying, hey, like, we would really appreciate it if some of you could maybe donate X, Y, and Z. Instead of saying that, they'll threaten you and say that you're selfish because you have all these resources you won't share, and bad things will happen to you if you don't. So I'd love to hear from everyone else. If you're if you are here, let me know what other examples. I'm just gonna put that in the chat here. What examples that you've experienced and what it was like. And I'm going to go through the article here as well. And I'm going to post the link to the article in here so that you can see what I'm looking at, in case you can look at that and see, what the, see if this link works. Read it and see if you can identify with any of that. Okay, great. So it looks like the articles come up. So that's what I'm looking through right now. So the first one is isolation, right? A lot of people who are in spiritually abusive environments or in abusive relationships talk about how they are isolated from people. They might be isolated from their friends. They might be isolated from their family. And again, this happens over time. And so you might be wondering, well, what does isolation look like and how does that happen? They can't put you, lock you in a room or anything like that. But isolation, from what I've seen, can happen through taking a lot of your time. So in a lot of these environments, people are expected to pretty much hand over all their free time to this institution. So if you are always at that place or doing things for them or with them, in some ways they're going to be isolated from the people that you care about, because what time do you have to spend with them? So that's one way of isolation. Um, Fabricating lies about you to others. That's something that's been noted here. And the lies can go both ways. And so sometimes people will be told lies about other people, right? There's this us versus them mentality. So you might be told things about your family, your friends, other people that aren't part of that institution. Things like, well, they're not as spiritual, or they're trying to lead you astray, or whatever it is. There could be all sorts of things that could be made up about them. And so one other thing, one of the number two over here is monitoring your activity throughout the day. And there are different ways in which that happens. This article says that they can do this through wiring your house to camera or recording devices, right? And so I can see that happening in situations where people are, maybe living with the abuser. When you are in a situation where this is happening through spiritual abuse and whatnot, it can happen through social media. So a lot of people have talked about how their social media has been weaponized in these environments. They might ask, well, where were you on this day? Here, I saw that you were at this place with this person. You shouldn't be there. You should have been doing X, Y, and Z. Has anybody had that happen to them? Had their social media like used against them or anything like that? So I'll be curious if you have. Let me know in the chat, or how you feel like social media has been used, against you, if it ever had been. One of the other ones here says denying you freedom and autonomy. So restricting access to transportation, not allowing you to go to work or school. And I can see this happening more in a one-on-one, not one-on-one, like within, if there's an abusive relationship in which the people live together or something along those lines, right? And so again, this is why I'm talking about things like spiritual abuse. This can also happen in abusive family dynamics, or in a situation with a romantic partner. We talked about gaslighting quite a bit. We know what that is, but gaslighting is a part of coercive control. So that's something that you're going to see often. Name calling and putting you down, frequent criticisms. Something that I've seen in this community, from what you all have told me, is that language is weaponized often in these spiritually abusive environments. So they might call you certain things. If you remember, I think it was either one or two live streams ago, we had a little bit of a fun time talking about the spiritual abuse bingo card and the certain things that people say in spiritually abusive environments, things that they might say to you or about you, saying that you have this type of spirit, or you are, what's the word I'm looking for? Like unresponsive to correction. There's certain language that has meaning and is used in these environments. And so while you might not be necessarily name called or put down like you would in a situation where it's, two people that know each other very well, language is weaponized. Now, number 6 is a significant one. It says limiting your access to money. And that's another way of that's another form of financial abuse. So you'll see things like in the article, it talks about putting you on a strict budget, limiting access to bank accounts, hiding financial resources, and monitoring what you spend. So if we look at this and apply this to how this can look in a spiritually abusive environment, telling people how to spend their money, or claiming that if you don't spend your money a certain way, these things are going to happen to you. That is limiting your access to money in a way. So some of you have talked about how you have been part of some sort of building fund, right? Where they'd say everyone has to sign this pledge that you're going to give certain amounts of money every month to this building fund. It may not have been a building, it might have been something else, but it was this project that the church decided, church or institution decided they were going to undertake. And, they never finished it, but they took everyone's money. So this is in some way, you know, messing with your money in a sense. They might not be physically restricting you from accessing your money, but when an institution is telling you this is how you have to spend your money, and like the example here in the comments, saying that you have to have your house has to be available for use by the church at any time. That's that's not appropriate, right? Because they're your resources. If somebody decides they want to share those things, that's one thing, but saying you have to do this or this bad thing will happen is something else. And so this definitely happens a lot with money. And another way this happens, interfering with how you spend your money, I guess, is a way of coercive control that abusive institutions can do. They might say, you, before you make that big purchase, you need to let us know. Some people have said they've gotten a tap on the shoulder after the institution found out that they bought something. Oh, you bought this house, but you didn't ask us if it was okay to buy that house in this area. Or, you bought a car and you didn't ask us if it was okay to buy that car, and we think that car is too nice and you should be spending your money doing something else. So has that happened to anybody? Has anybody tried to interfere with how you spend your money? And I'm going to also post that question in the chat. I know some of you might be at a place where you don't have the volume up, and so you can't hear what's being said. So I'll ask here in the chat. So I'm going to ask if you've experienced spiritual abuse or coercive control related to your money. So I see a comment here. Using Acts 4:35, when the people sold their property and land and laid it at the apostles' feet. It was a non-denominational, but had touches of apostolic, Pentecostal, and Israelite doctrines. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And we see that misuse of scripture there, right? So just because you see an example of what one group of people chose to do, and this is what you talked about there is not uncommon. You'll have places where they'll say this is what everyone did, so in that particular verse, so you have to do this same thing. And what the best, what I would say is that, look, if when people are in these institutions and when they're doing things like this, they want to I would say disregard or ignore the fact that people have their own free will, right? So people don't, abusive people in institutions don't like to ask outright for what they want usually. Instead of saying, hey, what, we would appreciate help in this area, help how you can. Instead of saying that, they're wanting to guilt people, intimidate people, and help make them feel like they owe that institution something. And so they want to get things that way instead of just asking for what they want. And the reason they won't ask for what they want is because if they ask, they have to realize that people can say no. People can say, no, I don't want to give my money to this cause or anything like that. So the finances are a big one, and that's something that I see often. For number 7, it says reinforcing traditional gender roles. And the article says, regardless of the type of relationship you have, your partner may try to make a distinction between who functions as the man and the woman in the relationship. They'll attempt to justify that women are homemakers and mothers while men are the breadwinners. Using this argument, they may coerce you into taking care of all the cleaning, cooking, and childcare. So if we relate this to what a spiritually abusive institution or environment might do, they could do those same things. Some of you have shared in the comments that as women, you've been told that you were wrong for getting a job or pursuing a degree. And that is an example of taking those traditional gender roles and weaponizing them against you, right? And so I believe someone had mentioned in one of the comments before that they were told that they either had to like not pursue a degree, or what they were told that whatever money that they got from that degree or job was like bad or tainted, something along those lines. And it was because they were, it was a woman that wanted, that wanted to get a career. They were told by that institution that that was not good, and their job was to, stay at home and take care of the kids. And again, it's not a matter of what, whether you ascribe to those gender roles or not. It's a matter of what you want to do. So if someone is saying that because you are this gender, this is what you have to do, then that's problematic, because it's trying to take away your free will. I'm going to go to this one. And it says controlling aspects of your health and body. So they're talking about, in this article, they are talking about how a person, an abusive partner, will try to tell you how much, what you can do with your body, basically. You can't eat this, you have to exercise this amount of minutes every day or whatnot. And there's a statement here that says you may feel as though you're always walking on eggshells and that your body is no longer your own. So looking at this from a spiritual abuse perspective, people have been told that as well, regarding how they address their bodies, right? They might not be told, about you can't eat this or whatnot, but they may be told that they can't go to see a doctor if they're sick. Some of you have talked about that, and said that when you went to this institution, they said, well, you can't see a doctor. If you see a doctor, it means that you don't have enough faith. Or if you see a doctor, it means that you're somehow in sin or a bad person. So that is something that can happen related to this type of coercive control, right? Or some people have also said that they were told they could only see certain types of professionals. You can only see this doctor, and that doctor is usually associated with that institution. Or you can only see this particular therapist, right? So some people have said that they had been struggling with mental health concerns, and they were either told not, that they couldn't see a therapist, or if they did see a therapist, it had to be somebody that they picked. And then, the therapist was telling the institution what was going on, which, you're not allowed to do that they can't do that unless you signed a release of information. So I'm curious if anybody has dealt with anything like that, feeling like your bodily or mental autonomy was challenged in these types of environments. Anybody relate to any of that? The next one here, the last two actually talk about threatening people and regulating like the type of relationships that you have. And that can also happen too. A lot of times people have shared how they were told that they had to marry a particular person. They could not marry a particular person. They had to get their marriage or their relationship sanctioned by that institution. And that also is a form of coercive control, right? People can make recommendations and say, oh, I think it'd be nice if, maybe you might want to consider seeing this person or whatnot. But, when people are told that they can only date or talk to a particular person, that's not healthy. That's a form of coercive control. I've also had people share, either on the channel or, elsewhere, about how that they felt that their relationships were being interfered with. And so somebody would say something along the lines of, you can't see this person. You're already seeing this person and we don't think it's a good relationship and we think you need to break up. And really without giving a good reason. Sometimes this has to do with, institutional politics, whatever. But the point is, when we see these sorts of things happening, the institution is putting their hands where they don't belong. And they're not here to tell people what to do. They're there for spiritual support. So, that's part of, there are lots of other aspects to coercive control. The point of that is it is something that happens over time. And it's something that is not only gradual, but it's pervasive. And so you'll see these either people or institutions slowly take over aspects of your life that you did not want to give them access to or control. Okay, I see in the comment here that says, I was in your comments the other day about gaslighting and mental abuse in the church. It's a horrible day. Pastor told me I must remain in a toxic relationship. I told them off. Well, good for you. I'm glad that you did not remain in a toxic relationship. And unfortunately, your experience is, I've heard people tell me about how they were in an institution and they were told to remain in an unhealthy relationship. And not even they could be unhealthy for various reasons, whether there's emotional abuse going on, physical abuse, all sorts of things. And they're told, well, you better stay in this relationship. I read an article about how that happened to one woman who was in a relationship with somebody who was abusive, and she divorced the person and was shamed in front of the whole church about that, because she was told you should, not stay. You should stay in that relationship, and she was told that she was a bad woman for divorcing her abusive husband. So, that is, a lot of these things happen. And the important thing to remember about coercive control is, when you are in an environment, like whatever environment you're in, you want to ask yourself, what is the role of that environment for you? Are you there to have somebody tell you what to do, or do you want support? And most people would say, yeah, I know they want support. We all want advice from time to time. I can imagine that somebody might say, hey, here's something that I'm going through. I would like to get advice about what to do. But nobody is necessarily signing up to be told what to do or how to run their lives. And coercive control is a way of a person or an institution to slowly get control over every aspect of somebody's life. People are being told, they can't work in certain jobs, they can't do certain things. And it's not only being told you can't do certain things, but it's also being threatened, that there's a threat of bad things happening to you if you do this thing. So that's an aspect of coercive control. We also talked about monitoring people, whether it's people looking at your social media, asking you lots of questions about your whereabouts. And that's not anything an institution has a right to be doing regarding your life. So it's important to keep these things in mind and ask yourself, how do these people behave when I say no to something? How do they behave when I have questions? Okay, hi. I see a comment here. Welcome. Just walked in, but there's the I will stop loving you if you don't XYZ. Yeah. So threats in that regard. Yeah, and that can happen. What I've been talking about here doesn't necessarily only occur with spiritual abuse. This can happen in interpersonal relationships. And unfortunately, people who have been through unhealthy relationships with either romantic partners or family members, they could range from unhealthy to abusive, will sometimes be in these spiritual situations and environments where they're doing the same sort of thing. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Does anybody have any comments or questions, or examples they want to share about any of this? So there's also, I talked before about the isolation. That's also something that's really important to remember. And when you find yourself, if you find yourself ever wondering if you are isolated or not, you can do a test and say, where was I? How connected was I to people outside this institution, maybe like 6 months ago or 3 months ago? When you are if you are part of a religious or spiritual group or an institution, it's important that they respect the fact that you have friends and family and relationships that are outside those four walls. And if they act as if those sorts of relationships or interactions are sinful or bad or harmful to you, and you should just dump everyone and only stick with them, that's a big red flag there. That's isolation. Trying to see here if there are any more comments. This church is very concerned if I report on Saturday, very much coercive control. Yeah. So I guess when you say report on Saturday, do you mean like maybe do they want you to only go there on a particular day or anything like that? Um, I'm curious about that. Um, but I do hear what you're saying. I know people have talked about how people will, an institution or a church might act concerned, but they're really not concerned. They might say, "Oh, where were you on this particular day? We're just checking in on you," but they really are being nosy, right? Or trying to figure out how come you weren't where they thought you were going to be. Um, and so yeah, and again, it's not unreasonable for people to want to know where people are at sometimes. Let's say there was a big event and you said you were going to show up and you didn't show up. Somebody might just ask out of concern, "Hey, I know you said you were going to be there. I hope everything's okay." But you'll be able to tell whether it's genuine concern or being nosy, right? And trying to control. Okay, so someone asked, how should I respond when they pry? That's a good question. I want to ask you all in the comments, how would you respond? 'Cause I think that's a really good question. I want to hear what you all have to say, but my advice would be to keep it pleasant and keep it neutral and then see what happens from there, right? So if they say, "Oh, you weren't at this," "Oh, yeah, you know what? I wasn't able to make it, but thanks for asking." I would just say something like that and then just see what they say. If they were really concerned, if they were truly concerned, that should be enough. Okay, well, they know, they see you there, they know you're okay. Um, but if they're asking more questions and acting as if you are somehow a bad person or not spiritual because of this and this, you'll be able to tell. So I say keep it pleasant and keep it neutral. Don't give them a lot of information, because I don't think a lot of things really just aren't people's business, right? If you couldn't make it, you couldn't make it. Now if you want to share more information, go ahead, but it doesn't I don't feel like you should have to share if you don't want to. Okay, so I see a comment here. They say Saturday is the only day. You'll only get this revelation in church, and if you don't observe, okay. And so they say that basically you're going to hell if you don't observe it. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and see that's I hear what you're saying with this coercive control. Basically saying that if you have to do this way, you can only come here on this day or whatever. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I'm starting to get comfortable in their uncomfortableness. So I'll ask them, why do you need to know the details? Yeah. Yeah, you could say, "Why are you asking?" And you can kind of, you'll know how to address that depending on the person and the situation and where you are. But that's important to ask and see if they'll, tell on themselves a little bit. They might say, "Well, because we expect X, Y, and Z of you." I always tell people, if you're in situations like this, really be careful about what you're posting on social media, because sometimes people might want to try and catch you in a trap. So they might say something like, "Well, you said you couldn't make it because you were busy, but I see here that you posted that you were on the beach. Um, Things like that. So just be careful. And I say, I recommend too that as you navigate these situations, you also document what happens. Um, and it's important to document things because a lot of gaslighting occurs in these types of environments. And so you might feel as if you something did or didn't happen when it really did because of how someone will respond to you. So that's a good question. I'm going to put that in the chat too. How do you So I see a comment here. Pastor sat me down and harshly lectured me about how I'm a liar and leaving a toxic friendship as a rebellion for not getting back into the relationship. Wow. Um, when I see something like that, um, it's concerning because somebody is trying to dictate to you about how to function in a relationship. Um, And I'm wondering, it sounds like that doesn't only happen with romantic relationships, but it can happen with just friendships as well. And so something else that you might want to be careful of too is a situation where somebody is trying to set you up with a mentor, right? And I'm not saying that being in a mentor-mentee relationship is a bad thing. I think mentorship can be helpful under certain circumstances, but I've seen situations like this where people are trying to, uh, let's say, set up a situation for control. Well, you're having this concern. You need to speak to so and so needs to mentor you. And that mentorship is really a situation where somebody is telling somebody else what to do. So now you have the institution turning the screws in the person, telling them they have to do X, Y, and Z, and then they have this other person put in place that's like over that person. So you really need to be careful with that. Okay, I see another individual here. Hi, Nathan. It looks like you're new. If you are, welcome. I left a church, and now everyone wants to know why I left. I did not. So maybe the comment wasn't finished or cut off. I'm assuming you might meant to say that I didn't let them know why. But that's also a something common that happens. Somebody leaves, and then everybody wants to know, well, why did you leave? You need to let us know why you left. Something else that I've heard too that really bothers me is that people are being told that they can't leave unless they have somewhere else they're going. So it's if let's say you're part of a group, you don't like it, you don't want to be there anymore, and you leave. I've heard people say, well, you can't leave unless you're going somewhere else. Like you can't just stop going. And again, this is where that control comes in. If you don't want to go anymore, you don't have to go, right? You don't owe any institution your attendance there, right? People should be able to go where they want. You're not, if you want to leave, then you can leave. But when people are being told that you can't leave unless you have somewhere else to go, and then we need to know where that other place is, that's not good. See another comment here. So it looks like there's a pastor getting involved in your relationship with someone else. Someone tells, yeah, that's between me and God. Yeah, that's something else you can say to somebody when they're being nosy or intrusive, or that's something you don't even have to answer. Sometimes I tell people, you can just smile and walk away if you feel uncomfortable. See a comment here that says, I was a mentor. Really, I was a snitch because all we did was tell the pastors their every move. Wow. Well, I appreciate your courage in admitting that. But yeah, that's why I tell people, be careful about this whole mentor thing or accountability partner or whatnot. Again, those things can be useful, I think, within short periods of time for certain reasons, but in abusive environments, they can be weaponized against you. Okay, I see another comment here that says, I did not want to expose the leadership. You didn't want to expose the bullying and coercive control of the leadership. And that's, I understand that, sometimes there are risks to exposing these sorts of things. People need to remember that it's you against an institution. They have a lot more people and a lot of finances and years to perfect this system behind them. And so it's already an unfair battle from the beginning. And I'm not saying that you should never expose anything, but I am saying that it's important to remember what you're up against. Oh, wow. So someone says here that pastor tried to keep me from leaving the church by forcing me to hear the lecture of why I cannot leave a relationship with someone else in the congregation. Wow. Something else to remember is that you don't owe anybody a relationship. And unfortunately, when these institutions get involved in people's personal relationships, it's really concerning, because you have the right to leave a relationship at any time. And so if you're involved with somebody or you have a friendship, there at times I think it can be good to explain why. But if your safety or your health is at risk, you just need to leave. You need to prioritize your well-being. And something else. Oh, hi Yvette, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you back. I've seen this play out sometimes in abusive institutions. So they'll say something like, if you're going to leave, you have to come and tell us why you're going to leave first. Like, you're not allowed to leave before this happens, right? And so what you said about how you were told that you had to hear a lecture about not leaving a relationship, like, that's just more of that control, because they're going to want to talk you out of it or extract as much as they can from you before you leave. And so that's why I frequently recommend that if you're going to leave, do so quietly and do so slowly, because once people get wind of the fact that they think you're leaving, they're going to try and do things to prevent you from leaving. And so sometimes people have said that they had an issue with somebody, right? Or they want to leave, they want to leave a relationship, they want to leave something. And so they're told, well, before you leave, you must sit down with that person and explain why, not realizing that can be very unsafe. That can be dangerous. I really like what you said here, Nathan. I agree. My safety is non-negotiable. That's great. I love that comment. And I think it's going to really serve a lot of us well if we remember that certain things are non-negotiable, right? Wish I could put a heart near that comment, but I just put a heart here. And I would like to hear from you all in the chat. What are your non-negotiables? And it's important to know those before you go into a relationship. There's one YouTuber that I like I've listened to over the years. Her name is Cassandra Mack. And so years ago, she had this video where she talked about the 3 things that she would not negotiate. She said that she doesn't let anyone mess with her money. And then she said the second M was her mini me, and the third was her man. So basically, if you want to adapt it to yourself, your family, if you're married, your spouse, your children, if you have any, and your money, right? And so it's important to understand, when you go into not only a relationship, but any kind of any of these spiritual environments, what are your non-negotiables? So true, Nathan. Your safety is important, is what one comment. Nathan says, you're my family. Yeah, great. That's important. Family is important, right? So you have to know going in what those non-negotiables are. And when you see, if you're in a situation where you feel like the arms of this institution are trying to reach into that, that's when you know to get out. Someone else says, okay, um, if I don't want to give someone a hug, I will block them with my arm if they come in for a hug. I love that. Yes, your bodily autonomy is really important. And for those of you who have, little ones, have children, it's important to teach them that. One thing that sometimes irritates me about some of these church environments is that saying, "Oh, let's give each other hugs." I mean, I get where they're coming from, but some of us don't want hugs, and some of us don't want hugs from certain people. So I like what you said. I like what you said, Beth. You'll block your arm if they block them with your arm if they come in for a hug. Um, I think that's great. And you're well within your rights, and teach the younger ones too to do that. It's not rude to say no thanks. I think it's important if you have young ones, to let them know that they're it's within their rights to say, I don't want a hug, no thanks, and offer their fist maybe for like a fist bump, or something like that, or their hand for a handshake. So I think that's also important. You don't that, and people are going to interpret things whichever way they want, and that's not your problem, but your bodily autonomy is really important. um Yeah. And so someone said, yeah, someone said they're going to let it know that they're being controlled and they're not going to be back. I like this one. Hi, Vivian. I don't think I've seen you here before. So if you're new here, welcome, Vivian. And it says, don't talk to me personally about me, my business, or my money unless I talk to you about it first. Yes. That is really important. And something that you'll see in these types of environments is that, and this is a big red flag, if you hear something about yourself that you didn't share with that person, right? There's a lot of, unfortunately, there can be gossip that's disguised under things like, oh, concern or prayer requests. And so sometimes, people will share things about the things you talked about, things about their business, their money, personal things. And then now they're hearing about it from somebody else. And that's a violation of your confidentiality. And remember that when you go in these environments, it's not something like no one is really signing anything protecting your rights, right? So you want to be very careful what you share with people. Always start out slowly, because whatever you share, it could get back to somebody else. I see another comment here. I really can't stand being triangulated by people. Sometimes women in church enjoy bullying each other via triangulation. Yeah, that's it's unfortunate. We've said, but it's true. Things like that do happen. And for those of you who don't know what triangulation is, it's something where, just imagine a triangle. So there's someone here, and then there are two people here at the bottom. So it's triangle, right? And triangulation is when one person pits two people against another. And they do that for control. Usually the person at the center of that triangle wants attention. They want to feel important. And so by triangulating one person against another, it boosts their self-esteem and it boosts their ego. So you'll see sometimes, we've talked about this before on our lives, is that there'll be somebody who the spiritual group will have a favorite, right? They'll have maybe a favorite person or a favorite family. And then now they'll create a competitor and then watch those two, number one fighting number two who's vying for number one spot. And that makes the person in the middle feel in control, especially since a lot of times whoever is at the center of that triangle, the two other people are competing for their attention or their favor. So it makes that person feel important. See another comment here. The reason why I've learned to keep my business to myself is because your business will be spread like the National Enquirer. Yep. Yeah, yeah. I'll put that in the chat. I'm going to ask you if you all have experienced that. Nathan says like the National Enquirer, and that is the truth. And sometimes, when things like this happen, don't dismiss it, right? We know that yes, in certain places people talk, but that spreading of that information, I wouldn't say that it's always accidental. And I have witnessed situations in where people do this, and they do this. I feel like it's done to sort of show that it's sort of to put you in your place, right? People have talked about how they have had things happen to them, or they've talked about something sensitive that somebody with common sense would know I shouldn't share this with other people, right? And then they do anyway. And the person who has had their business spread like that, it's a very, it can make you feel ashamed. It can also make you feel very little, right? And it takes away your control. When people do things like that to someone else, it's basically saying, you know what, I can talk about you whatever way I want to, right? And basically your rights and your preferences don't mean anything to me. So, I know that yes, sometimes people may share things by accident, but don't just overlook it if you feel like your information is being talked about. And if you need to, find the person if you know who is behind it and tell them to cut it out. I had to do that once, and I think sometimes people get caught off guard when things like that happen, and it's a way of showing that you're aware of something and you don't want it to happen anymore. So, we all have to use our judgment and things like this, but you can definitely, if you know who's behind it, confront them on it. Someone says, oh my goodness, someone says that they were told by their pastor that they can't move to another city, and they were told that God would curse them, um, and told them they can't keep running further from their problems. Yeah, that's a classic one right there. People being told that, that, well, if you move, you're just going to have more problems, or, basically being told that whatever that person wants to do to advance their life or change their life is going to be futile. Up on the platform didn't mention my name, but it was verbatim what I said to him. I actually have a video on that coming up about when a pastor or leader talks about you from the pulpit or in a platform, and that's another way of coercive control, right? We talked about the article that I had sent out, listed various ways in which coercive control can happen. And so if you are sharing private information, someone is talking about you from the pulpit, that is a way of not only controlling you, but shaming and humiliating you. And they don't even have to use your name because that was your information being shared. And then someone does in prayer group, they'll say, let's pray for so-and-so. And then all they do is just tell their business. I started praying at home. Yeah. Be careful with those, prayer requests too, and it's unfortunate that it has to get to that. It'd be nice if you could say, hey, like I want to share something with someone for prayer. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but, read the room and see how people around you are sharing these things. Are they praying out of genuine concern, or is it just a reason for gossip? So someone said that they drove someplace to tell them to stop fishing in a certain place. And, some of these institutions, they'll do that. I'll ask you guys some of the questions in the comments here. If you've ever being talked about in the pulpit or from a platform. And then also I want to ask if you've ever been visited in your home unannounced. And I think that's really important. Some people have asked me, well, what do I do to keep myself safe from things like this? And I say, be very slow and careful in sharing your information. They have those new visitor forms, and they say, put your phone number and address. And people have told me how people have shown up at their home, and they felt very uncomfortable, Um, and so if you don't want someone to show up at your home or your place of work, then I would say wait before you just put that information there. I think it's a huge violation of privacy to do that to somebody without asking for their permission. I mean, people visit people all the time, but to just show up to someone's house who you don't know for whatever reason to say, oh, I want to, they want to ask you to give money to something or tell you should or shouldn't do something. That's another form of control right there. I was once a sermon topic when I first was saved many years ago. The pastor made sure to look directly at me and repeated it 3 times for emphasis. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so that's giving things away, right? Looking at you, they might not have ever mentioned you by name, but it's pretty clear who they're talking about. And this happens more often than you would think. Everybody's kind of like an open secret. Everybody knows that maybe this person went through this issue and it's being talked about and there are no names. We all know who the person's talking about. Yep, unannounced visits to get chewed out, trying to control what goes on in your home. Yeah, so it's important to have, we always want to know what your non-negotiables are up front and be careful what you share. It's we have to use not only common sense and discretion, but we want to be very cautious too. Yeah, this is public information. I worked at a church and found this out. I asked for my information to be removed. I also had the pastor's wife one evening point and laughed and said, I know how old you are. Oh my, that's petty and a violation of your privacy. And I'm really sorry that happened, but be careful. Ask how your information is going to be used. And even if they tell you we're not going to publish this, well, do your homework first, right? I just in the day and age that we live in, yes, there's information about people on the internet and things like that, but you also want to be you just want to be careful what information not only this institution has about you, but who can access it, right? Um, Yeah, and someone else is saying here how they, someone tried to get someone to move into their home, and when they said no, they got shunned at another church. And so for some of these churches or some of these institutions, they have networks, and so if you have issues at one, they can spread information at another place, and it could be wrong information, but it's still there. Yes, trying to control what goes on in your home is huge in cult-like churches. I was scolded by the pastor who accused me of not tithing correctly and reported me to my husband at the time. Wow. I'm really sorry that happened. Imagine that wasn't their information to share. And imagine, if that, I just think about that could have turned, depending on who the person was, that may have been made a bad situation even worse. Beth says Christian cartels. Yeah, yeah. People have talked about how people have showed up at their home before. They said that they signed some sort of building pledge or something, and people showed up wanting to know where their money was. And they had felt forced to sign those things, being, you know, something that it's important to remember is that one, coercive control can look a lot of different ways, but harassment is one of them. Getting harassing phone calls or texts. And when I say harassing, I mean repeated when you said no. So let's say you said, I don't want to contribute to this thing. I don't want to go to this thing. I don't want to sign up. And then you keep getting calls and texts about it. Are you sure? We haven't gotten your response yet. Can you think it over? Can we have a meeting? That's manipulation, and that's somebody not respecting your no. And that's a huge red flag to me. So if you are in a place, you say, I don't want to do this, then that needs to be enough. And if they're contacting you repeatedly about it and they won't leave you alone, then that's a big red flag, because what they're basically saying is, we've heard your no and we don't care and we're not going to respect that. Yeah, somebody said Oklahoma and Kansas they is the worst is one of the worst areas they've seen for someone in the faith. It's awful. They're people. I hear what you're saying, and people from around the country, around the world have talked about their own challenges related to where they are, and so I believe abusive behavior transcends geography and culture, and you're going to see these things in lots of environments. Um, and again, it's all hid behind a veneer. It's all hidden behind a veneer of niceness. When people talk about these things, they'll say, "When I started going to this church or started going to this place, I never imagined them to be like this." And so I also want to encourage you too to exercise your autonomy as you can, and even if if you're in a place, find out, what they're doing with your information, right? If you can, I think it's a good thing when people ask you to opt into certain things. Do you want to receive mail from us? Do you want to receive this? You should have the option to opt out. I don't like it concerns me when I see sneaky things like you sign up, or you go to a church or something as a new person that you just start getting spammed with all these this mail and text messages and things like that you didn't sign up for. Someone sharing their story here. They said the head pastor's wife was manipulative. She never accepted my no. She pushed hard until she got her way. I experienced burnout for a year after I quit. Now I call a spade a spade. I like that. I'm sorry that that happened to you, first of all. And I've noticed here that a lot of you, after going through the challenges of spiritual abuse and control and manipulation, that now you have left with a sense of boldness, and though you're not afraid to call things out for what they are. And I think that's great. Sometimes people need to hear from other people that aren't going to accept that type of manipulation, right? So, excuse me, saying that you don't want to do something, asking a question, saying that I don't want to do this. I don't like this. Standing up for yourself is really important. And I think it's, as yeah, I hear a message, I see a message here. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. And that's going to be something that is going to be a vital key to your recovery in these types of situations and also survival. Sometimes it can be hard to think about what to say in the moment, especially if you've been through other challenging situations, or other abusive situations. But stand up for yourself when you can. And calling a spade a spade. If you're one rule that I think can be helpful is delaying commitment to anything. So if somebody asks you to do something, never commit on the spot. Let them know you'll think about it and see how they react. If they get pushy about it or start bugging you, that's a red flag. So if they say, "Oh, do you want to bring, do you want to head up this committee, or do you want to do X, Y, and Z?" Then let them know, you know what, I'll get back to you. And take your time. Let them know you'll get back to them in, a few days or a week or whatever. Hey, Bishop Davis. See here, when I started saying no, that's when the love stopped. Yep. A lot of you have said very similar things, that when you have come in to a situation and you've gone along with their agenda for a while and they start standing up for yourself, then all of a sudden everything gets cold. Wow. Someone else here says, with mental illness, getting yelled at by pastors has really made my situation much worse. Going places I shouldn't be, toxic church. Yeah, what's up with the yelling? I'm seeing a lot of that in the comments. People just yelling a lot in these situations, which is just, yeah. Uh, um, and you talked about there with mental illness. People have shared how they've been told that they shouldn't get therapy or they shouldn't get medical help for issues. And so that's also part of this coercive control, right? This us versus them. You go to a doctor, they're bad. Don't go to doctors because they're bad. Don't go to therapists because they're bad. Don't go to the police or don't get an attorney. It's this strict division of things. I hadn't missed any comments. I'm looking here. If I missed your comment, let me know. Um, okay, I see another comment here. I'm recovering, but after a year, I can't bring myself to join another church. Spiritual abuse is very traumatic. And, I'm sorry that you went through that. A lot of people have shared those experiences. And what I'm seeing too is that people will say that they've experienced these things more than once. So they went somewhere and there were lots of red flags. They left, they went somewhere else. Same thing. So it's important that you take your time and really make sure that as you are getting, if whatever you decide to do, that you have your eyes and your ears open. Because things like this, unfortunately, the more they happen, the more it can really wear down somebody's soul and really, they'll start to question, is it worth it to even join with other people around my spirituality because of things like this? And the great news is that, I've heard from people personally that they said they've eventually found places that they found were healthy, but they had to take their time and they had to not be desperate to be part of another community. So it's important to take your time, not to just jump in to a new place. To make sure I didn't miss anything. You all have shared some really helpful and insightful comments and stories. I mean, the stories that you've shared are, on one hand, they're really unfortunate. I'm sorry that people have had to go through these sorts of things. But at the same time, I'm glad to see how a lot of you are becoming bold and standing up for yourself and calling things for what they are. Yeah, someone else is talking about how they were yelled at by the pastor. This experience forced me to read the Bible and see what they were saying and doing was wrong. Now I have scripture to back me up. And that's very important that you learn to read, that you learn to see and read things for yourself, because in situations like this, people will, sort of like rely on, well, not rely on ignorance. I would say they want to, they're hoping that you won't do the legwork in looking at things for yourself. And even when people have, they'll say, well, look, I studied this scripture, I looked at this thing, and it wasn't what you guys are saying. They might say, well, you don't have enough experience to interpret that correctly. So even if you do look up things yourself, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll believe, but it's important that you believe um, what you are studying, and you have the case build up for yourself. Because in situations like this, people will try to control you. They'll try to tell you this is how you have to live your life, and this is what this says, and twist things for their own agenda. So it's really important that you read and understand for yourself. Yeah, they want passive learning, right? And so it's dangerous if you read yourself and come up with your own, your own understanding of it. And with things like this, again, it's really important that not only do you learn to stand up for yourself in front of someone else, but also privately, meaning that if someone tells you something, you have every right to check it out. You have every right to question it. Asking questions doesn't make you a bad person. Yeah, someone else talks about how they never studied any other book. It's just like the first five books of the Bible, and then that was it. And then they, didn't study anything else. I'm assuming, are you saying that they said you couldn't look at any other books either? That happens sometimes in these types of environments where what you read is being controlled. You can't read this. This is you have to read only this thing here. And so, and follow up with another comment. It's not just that people want passive learners; they just want passive people in general. So anything you do that is not passive, whether you're asking questions, setting boundaries, um, deciding what you will and won't do with your time, money, resources, those are threats to these types of environments. So these are all great comments here. Getting ready to wrap up. And so I appreciate the feedback here and just the interaction in the live. I have videos that get posted to the channel every week. It's usually Thursdays at 6 p.m. And then there's also a lot on the community tab as well. So, on the community tab, that's a place where you all can interact with each other and also share with me what other sorts of things that you'd like to see. Yes, they created a threat, me with a smiley face. I like that, Beth. Yeah. And that's true. Sometimes with these situations, spiritually abusive people and institutions think they're destroying you, but they're actually creating a very resilient person that's stronger coming out than they were going in. And so, for all of you who are seeing this and are going through this, there are other people in the comments that have survived this and have come out totally different. And I love seeing how you all are encouraging each other, standing up to people and systems, and doing things in a way that work for your life. When people are being told they can't move, they can't get this job or education or whatnot, that is spiritual abuse. No one should be telling you what you should or should not do with your life. That's your decision to make. A spiritual community, and a healthy one at that, is there to support and provide resources, not to dictate and control. They expect me to respect their boundaries, but mine absolutely don't matter. Yeah, that's a huge red flag when you are in a spiritual environment. It's very one way. So the leader, the needs and the reputation of the leader are exalted above everybody else, right? And so their boundaries matter, but yours don't. And when we go into these environments, think about what your non-negotiables are. I talked about that earlier, and also talk about what your boundaries are and have them in place. So if your boundaries are around your time, right? What boundaries are you going to maintain? These are things that you want to have a solid idea of when you are interacting with people in these spiritual environments, right? A healthy environment will respect that. They're going to respect your needs. They're going to respect your boundaries. They're not going to feel entitled to what is important to you. Okay. So, let's see. Looks like I got everything. So, I really appreciate all of your contributions today. And, thank you for sharing your stories. And one thing I really like about this community is that you all are very supportive to one another. And that's really important to see because, for some people, this, being able to share things like this with other people is very important. A lot of times, if you have been through something like this and you try to share it with somebody who has not experienced it, you don't know what is going to, you don't know what the response is going to be. The person could listen, but a lot of times people dismiss spiritual abuse because they don't believe that it's a real thing. You know, we expect so much of these spiritual environments and we think that they're beyond reproach. And so I'm really glad to see the community coming together here. I like seeing how you all support one another, look out for one another, and encourage each other. So I want you to continue doing that because it's important. I want people to have a safe place where they can talk about what's happened to them and how they're processing it. Okay? So you guys are great. I really enjoy these and I hope to do more of these in the future. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. All right? Take care. Bye-bye.